Arthur Corian stood quietly at the edge of the pier, his thin frame hunched slightly within the folds of a simple weathered windbreaker. At 89 years old, every motion he made carried the weight of a lifetime. His bones ached from 1,000 mornings, and his hands, gnarled by age, trembled faintly as if they remembered a youth spent clutching the hard edges of steel and rope. Yet his eyes remained steady, piercing even as the rest of him betrayed fragility. They weren't on the young officer who barked at him, but on the towering bulk of gray metal before him, the USS Dauntless. She was massive, a living symbol of modern naval power. The air held the sharp tang of salt water mixed with the sweet chemical bite of fresh paint, and something subtler still, a crisp metallic scent that awakened echoes buried under 70 years of memory. To Arthur, this was not merely a ship. It was a monument, a continuation of something he once knew intimately. The sea, the fight, and the brotherhood of sailors. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the gangway." The voice snapped like a whip, firm and disciplined. Lieutenant Rostova, the officer of the deck, radiated crispness. Her polished uniform seemed pressed against her skin like armor, her blonde hair bound in a bun so tight it looked as though it hurt. Her nameplate gleamed in the pale light, her manner sharp-edged and absolute. She was young, unyielding, and certain, and certainty is often loudest in the young. Arthur knew her type well. He had once embodied it. At 19, he too had seen the world in black and white, rules and structure like scripture. But now he had traveled too many roads, seen too much gray, and carried too many ghosts to be folded neatly into the box she wanted him to fit. He offered her only a small, weary smile, saying nothing. The lieutenant stiffened, her sense of authority grinding against his quiet refusal. She pointed toward a roped-off, crowded section of the pier where spectators gathered. Families holding flags and flowers, local officials eager for photographs, hobbyists with cameras slung at their hips. "That is where you are permitted to stand, sir. This quarterdeck is a controlled space." The words were steel, but her tone, sharp and rehearsed, betrayed impatience already stretched thin. "I was invited," Arthur rasped, his voice faint but steady. He reached slowly into the pocket of his jacket. The paper inside was folded soft from his constant touch. The letter, his proof, had arrived neatly embossed direct from the office of the Secretary of the Navy. He had checked its words again and again, almost disbelieving them. And yet Rostova dismissed him before he could draw the delicate document out. "Everyone has a story, sir," she said flatly, with the sigh of someone who had repeated those words a dozen times to tourists and stragglers. To her, he was simply another elderly veteran, confused or stumbling into places he didn't belong. Beside her, another officer barely out of training shifted uncomfortably, his face caught between duty and unease. He seemed to sense something in Arthur, something the lieutenant's rulebook couldn't see. But Rostova's stance was ironclad. She squared her shoulders, eyes locked onto Arthur as though he were not a man but an obstacle. "Unless you have a current military ID or a specific access credential for this event, you cannot proceed." "That is final." Around them, the murmurs began. Curious faces turned in unison as the crowd took notice. Conversations tapered into silence as whispers, pitying or condescending, rippled like a tide. Some raised phones, dark lenses hungry for entertainment or scandal, reducing his quiet struggle to spectacle. Arthur felt the weight of their observation pressing against him, the heat of shame radiating along his neck. He was no spectacle. He was just a tired old sailor trying to walk aboard a ship. Lieutenant Rostova's posture stiffened further, embodying everything he once knew about rigid military authority. With her feet planted shoulder-width apart, arms folded behind her back, she was the immovable wall of naval discipline. In her eyes, he was not an honored guest, not a quiet witness of history, but a variable, a loose piece in the perfect math of her responsibilities. Confused, out of line, an inconvenience to be solved quickly and clinically. Arthur's hand finally pulled free of his pocket, clutching the folded letter. His voice broke the silence. "I have this." He extended it, fragile fingers trembling faintly. She took it with almost dismissive courtesy, glancing over it without truly reading. To her it was just more paper, more distractions. "A form letter," she pronounced, handing it back as though it were a meaningless trinket. "We thank you for your service, but this does not grant you access to the quarterdeck." The other young officer opened his mouth hesitantly. "Lieutenant, maybe we should check with the captain's office." But her sharp rebuke cut him short, her voice low but biting. "Ensign, I am the officer of the deck. The safety and security of the ship is my responsibility. I will not harass the captain with this nonsense." Arthur stood there bearing the weight of a lifetime, knowing the sting of humiliation without lowering his shoulders. His jacket shifted as the breeze tugged at it, and with it, the fabric revealed the small patch stitched into the left breast. A dark blue circle, a silver trident breaking through a dark storm cloud. Its threads frayed, its colors faded by decades. An artifact more powerful than the letter she had dismissed. Lieutenant Rostova's eyes narrowed. She lifted her hand and tapped the patch. Her lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "And what exactly is this supposed to be? A souvenir? Something from a reunion? Maybe your local VFW post?" That casual disdain, the blunt lack of recognition, cut deeper than the crowd's whispers or her rigid rejection. In that moment, all the noise of the pier, the cameras, the children's voices, the mechanical creak of the ship at its moorings, dissolved. For Arthur, time slipped. His aging body stood on a sunny pier, but his mind dived headlong into a roaring sea 70 years behind him. The scent of salt became strangling diesel fumes. The lieutenant's mocking touch became the shock of enemy fire. And within that memory he was young again, clinging to the sleeve of a comrade whose patch gleamed bright and new against terror and freezing spray. And on the pier, in the present, Arthur said nothing. His silence itself was heavy as steel, weighted with an entire war that the lieutenant could not see. The confrontation lingered thick in the air, tension suspended between the frail veteran and the iron-willed lieutenant. The murmuring of the crowd sharpened into an uncomfortable hum, as if the entire pier was watching a play unfold and waiting for the climax. Phones, like a field of black, watchful eyes, stayed raised, recording a moment that to most seemed trivial. An elderly man being told he was not important enough to pass. But one pair of eyes did not see it that way. Chief Petty Officer Miller had been standing at the fringes of the gathering, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression unreadable. At first glance he was unremarkable, a man wearing a well-worn uniform decorated only with the quiet hash marks and service stripes earned not by decoration, but by persistence. He was not a man of theatrics. If anything, he was invisible compared to the young and polished lieutenant's rigid poise. Yet invisibility had always been one of his greatest strengths. 30 years in the Navy trains a man not just to serve but to listen, to observe the subtleties, the flicker of hesitation, the unspoken note in another man's voice, the weight of silence where there should have been compliance. And as his gaze settled on Arthur Corian, Chief Miller's instincts screamed that something here was not what it seemed. He had seen countless veterans before, men and women lingering at ceremony gates, many dazed by time, some looking only for a chance to peek at the ships. Most had stories true enough but ordinary, easily measured and catalogued. Arthur was not like them. It wasn't the jacket or the folded letter, or even the stubborn refusal to leave. It was his posture, the way he stood motionless but centered, anchored like a man who had faced storms bigger than regulations or red tape. Then there was his silence. It did not carry confusion as Rostova suspected. It carried patience, dangerous patience, the kind one only learns when patience was once the line between living and dying. And then Miller's eyes traced the faint faded patch on Arthur's jacket. He leaned slightly forward and squinted, his weathered sailor's mind flipping through the vast encyclopedia of emblems, insignias, and unit patches he'd seen. And yet this one he could not place. A trident piercing a storm cloud. Old, frayed. The insignia seemed almost reluctant to exist in the sunlight, as though the threads remembered hiding in shadows more than resting on parade fields. It stirred something in him, a prick at the back of his memory, the way an odd tune can haunt even if you don't know the lyrics. And Miller knew one thing: patches like that don't appear by accident. He watched intently as Rostova continued in her clipped, cold tone. Her rebuke of the young ensign was sharp enough to sting even from a distance, but the chief's attention wasn't on her. It was on Arthur's eyes. There it was, that look, that hollow stare that Miller had seen only in the faces of old chiefs, submariners, and frogmen who had done things impossible for a world that had long since polished their danger into clean, little paragraphs in history books. This was not a man who got lost at a pier. This was a man whose silence was louder than Rostova's orders. And something inside Miller snapped into focus. This could go very, very wrong. Without hesitation, he stepped a few paces away from the crowd, pulling his phone from his pocket. The move was casual, practiced. He did not want to add fuel to the spectacle. Holding the device low at his side, he thumbed in a number not many enlisted men ever carried. The direct line of the Admiral's flag aid, a call Miller had been saving for contingencies heavier than broken locks or handling VIP families. The voice that answered on the line was clipped, distracted, already impatient. "Chief Miller, I'm in the middle of the Admiral's pre-brief. Make it short." "Yeah, I'll be short," Miller said, his voice calm but taut, like a rope pulled against current. "There's a situation on the quarterdeck. Lieutenant Rostova is about to detain a civilian, an old veteran." There was a slight huff of annoyance on the other end. "A civilian? The lieutenant can handle that." "It's not—" "No." Miller cut him off, firm, his voice gaining gravity. "The OD is the problem, not the solution. You need to get the Admiral down here now. This man, he's wearing a patch I don't recognize. And you know me. 30 years I've seen every unofficial souvenir and commemorative crest you can imagine. But this patch is different. Trident through a storm cloud, faded. Old. And the way that lieutenant's treating him? If we're wrong, fine. But if I'm right, if this is something more, then the Admiral will want to see it with his own eyes. And we don't have long." For a moment, the aide was silent on the other end, the irritation draining away without words. The chief could almost hear the weight behind the quiet realization that Miller was not a man prone to drama. If he was calling with this tone, then fire was already licking at the powder keg. "I'll tell him," the aide finally said, lowering his voice with sudden seriousness. "Stay where you are, Chief. Don't let anything happen until he arrives." Miller ended the call, sliding the phone back into his pocket. His face betrayed none of what boiled beneath. Years had taught him that calm was a weapon. Around him, the pier buzzed with curiosity, the crowd still whispering, still raising phones to capture humiliation. Rostova's hand twitched at the edge of Arthur's sleeve, her final warnings thick with the conviction her training had carved into her. She didn't yet see the tremor in the foundation of her certainty, but Miller knew. Something inside him hummed with the instinct honed over decades at sea. Storms were coming, yes, but for once they were not the kind that came from weather. They were the kind that broke history wide open. On the bridge of the USS Dauntless, Rear Admiral Thompson sat at the center of a controlled storm. The commissioning ceremony was scheduled down to the minute, and his staff moved around him like clockwork, murmuring brief updates, adjusting lists, fine-tuning the order of events. For Thompson, this was another chapter in an already distinguished career. He had worn his stars for years, carried his uniform with crisp precision, and could recite the proper flow of such ceremonies in his sleep. In truth, this should have been routine. Flags unfurled, speeches polished, sailors at attention, and a polished new warship gleaming under the sun. But all of that mundane control fractured at the mention of one word: patch. His flag aide had approached, shuffling awkwardly, his voice hesitant. "Sir, Chief Miller has called in from the pier. He says Lieutenant Rostova is detaining an elderly civilian. The man's wearing a patch." He described it: silver trident, storm cloud, blue circle. At those words, Thompson's thoughts derailed with the squeal of steel against steel. His brow furrowed, his mind searching with the speed of a man startled into remembering something half buried in secrecy. "Say that again," he demanded, his tone dragging the air in the room to silence. "A trident, sir, piercing a storm cloud on a dark field." The Admiral froze for no more than a heartbeat, but it was enough for every officer nearby to notice. Then, without a word, he strode toward the navigation table where a hardened, encrypted laptop sat ready for classified reference. Fingers that were usually precise but unhurried now flew across the keyboard. He typed access codes drilled into him long ago, strings of numbers and letters that opened doors very few dared knock upon. His staff swapped confused glances, whispering under their breaths, but Thompson gave them nothing. His focus had sharpened into something rare, almost foreign on a day designed to celebrate pomp and polish. The terminal unlocked. He navigated down into the layers of sealed archives, not the polished, declassified histories trotted out for museum tours, but the shadow vaults of operations that officially never occurred. Finally, he stopped at a title buried so deep it required not one but two levels of authentication to access. Operation Sea Serpent. He clicked it, and the screen bloomed with the image, a projected scan of an old, hand-drawn insignia. A storm cloud ruptured by a silver trident, curling lines suggesting perilous seas around it. The insignia matched exactly what the chief had described. For Thompson, the sight was like a blade of ice sliding into his chest. He exhaled slowly, staring at the insignia as if it might disappear if he looked away. Memories, tales whispered quietly within classified circles resurfaced. Sea Serpent, long scrubbed from every public record. The mission no one was supposed to speak of. The mission that had haunted Admiralty for generations because its men had gone unseen, unheard, but never untested. Get the captain, the XO. The command master chief now, Thompson barked, his voice dark with urgency. His staff flinched but scrambled at once. And clear a path to the quarterdeck. Within moments, the admiral and his entourage were striding with thunderous purpose across the steel spine of the ship and down the gangway. Their steps rang like hammer blows echoing across the pier. The crowd noticed first in puzzled fragments, then in wide-eyed silence. People who had been smirking at the supposed spectacle of an obstinate old man now quieted, sensing something shifting entirely out of their scope of understanding. Phones lowered. Children hushed. Rostova stiffened, her hand still a breath from Arthur's thin arm when the admiral's voice cracked across the distance. "Lieutenant, stand down." The command was absolute. It snapped across the pier like the crack of a rifle. Rostova froze, her body locking into rigid attention. Her fingers twitched back from Arthur's jacket, her cheeks washing pale. She had not expected her authority to be swept away in a single, thunderous sentence, and certainly not in front of hundreds of eyes. But Admiral Thompson's gaze didn't fall on her, not once. His eyes locked on Arthur, and everything about the admiral's bearing shifted in that instant. His stride lengthened. His jaw tightened not with irritation but with something much heavier, recognition. The admiral stopped one measured pace before Arthur Corian. The old man stood exactly as he had before, weather-beaten and quiet. But the entire air around him had transformed. For the crowd, something unspoken moved like a silent tide. They no longer saw a frail relic fumbling for credentials. They saw someone who had suddenly drawn the weight of the Navy's highest-ranking respect upon himself. And then, in a motion that seemed to cut the air, Admiral Thompson raised his hand in salute. Not a casual salute, not the perfunctory gesture of ceremony, but a salute as sharp and heartfelt as the man had ever given. His hand trembled faintly with the gravity of it. "Mr. Corian," he said, his voice thick with restrained emotion, yet carrying across the pier with iron clarity, "it is an honor." "Sir," the officers flanking him, the captain, the XO, the command master chief, snapped upright and followed, rendering their own salutes without hesitation. Uniforms stiff, shoulders squared, every line of their posture poured reverence. And in the silence that followed, the crowd gasped collectively as though watching stone turn suddenly to living flesh. For the first time in decades, Arthur was no longer invisible. The pier trembled in silence as though every voice had been stolen by the sight before them. The salute hung in the air like a banner, the admiral's hand frozen at his brow, his face bowed not to rank but to reverence. Behind him, his assembled officers mirrored him, rigid in posture, crystalline in purpose. Together, their motion formed a wave of respect that washed over the onlookers. What had begun as whispers of pity and irritation blossomed now into hushed awe. Phones, still raised by restless hands in the crowd, captured not a humiliation, but a miracle. The moment authority bent in total honor before age, before memory, before a man most had overlooked. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the pier carried the weight of history suddenly remembered. Arthur Corian did not move. He gazed at Thompson with eyes neither proud nor humbled, but steady, as if accepting the salute on behalf of men long buried in nameless graves. In his stillness was both dignity and grief, a quiet acknowledgement that recognition had finally come, though it had come decades too late for most. He might have looked thin, his jacket worn and faded, but in that moment Arthur grew impossibly tall. The admiral's voice carried across the pier, every syllable carved like an inscription in stone. "For those of you who do not yet understand what stands before you," he declared, turning slightly to face the silent audience, "allow me to enlighten you. This man is Arthur Corian, and that patch on his chest," he gestured toward the time-worn emblem stitched to Arthur's jacket, "is not a trinket, not a souvenir, not a joke. It is the mark of a unit that officially never existed, A unit drawn together by secrecy and bound by impossible odds. A unit whose courage shaped the seas you sail safely upon today. This man is the last surviving member of Operation Sea Serpent. Gasps rippled through the onlookers like a tide breaking against stone. Even the crowd of civilians, mostly unfamiliar with military lore, felt the gravity of the words. The sailors in the audience, however, straightened with stunned rigidity. They recognized at once that the admiral was revealing something beyond casual reverence. He was unsealing forgotten history, opening a locked chest of sacrifice darkened for 70 years. His words painted the mission in sharp strokes. 12 men sent into frozen waters, threading rafts through minefields and patrols under the cover of night, attaching limpets to enemy hulls under a gauntlet of searchlights and gunfire. 12 had gone. 4 returned. 4 men who had saved 5,000 sailors that night, and had been erased to protect the secrecy of their success. And this man, the admiral said, his voice thick but unflinching, was the junior officer who led them. The silence that followed was deeper than applause could have ever been. Arthur stood beneath the weight of those words, feeling a familiar hollowness in his chest where once 12 brothers had lived, now reduced to memory. The crowd no longer saw an old man turned away at a rope. They saw a titan, a ghost among them, carrying the enormity of history in the simplest of creased letters and stitched patches. The admiral's eyes finally shifted, locking onto Lieutenant Rostova. The young woman stood stiff at attention, blood drained from her face, her composure crumbling despite her rigid bearing. Thompson moved closer, his expression cold steel, each word clipped and merciless. "Lieutenant," he said, "you stand on the deck of a ship named Dauntless, meant to honor courage greater than fear. You wear a uniform stitched to an institution defined by sacrifice, and yet when faced with a man who is that very history, who embodies that courage, you did not see him. You did not pause, you did not ask, you did not look. You exerted authority without judgment." His voice dropped lower, quieter but sharper for its restraint. "Like a knife hidden under velvet. Your uniform grants you power. That power demands wisdom, but wisdom requires vision, compassion. You have failed that demand in a spectacular fashion." The words were flint against stone, striking sparks across the pier. Rostova's eyes glistened, her rigid stance faltering as the enormity of her failure bore down on her. "Report to my flag captain's office at 800 tomorrow," Thompson concluded, his voice heavy with finality. "We will have a very long conversation about your future." The crowd stirred faintly, pity shifting now toward the lieutenant, whose face carried not defiance, but a burning humiliation. Yet before the silence shattered further, Arthur raised one trembling hand, not in protest but in quiet intercession. "Admiral," he said, voice soft but carrying across the silence. The crowd hung on the faint rasp. His gaze turned to Rostova, and though his body was aged, his eyes carried the calm strength of a storm weathered long ago. She was doing her job. "Perhaps a little too well," he allowed, with the faintest flicker of a smile that broke tension without mocking. "Don't be too hard on her. The best lessons are always the hardest ones. I ought to know. Those were the lessons that shaped us out there." The admiral exhaled, shoulders softening as though Arthur had reached out and steadied him. He gave a slow nod, and in the quiet grace of that moment the spell deepened. The recognition that true greatness lay not only in valor under fire, but in compassion after the storm. Arthur lowered his hand, his gaze distant again. He had stood tall for his fallen comrades, endured judgment and tempered authority with mercy. On that pier he had reclaimed his story, but more importantly he had reminded them all, Rostova, Thompson, and every onlooker craning their necks, that the Navy's legacy was not just about ships or salutes. It was about people. Broken, stubborn, enduring people. And on that day, the pier of the USS Dauntless carried more than ceremonies could stage. It carried judgment, grace, and the reminder that courage, when met with humility, could bind generations in silence deeper than any anthem. In the days that followed the incident at the pier, whispers turned into stories, and stories into a legend that spread quietly across the base and beyond. Sailors told it with a hushed reverence, civilians repeated it with awe, and every retelling seemed to draw new wonder from the same unforgettable image. An admiral saluting an old man in a faded jacket while the entire senior staff stood tall beside him. It was not the commissioning ceremony of the USS Dauntless that people remembered, though the speeches had been flawless. the flags crisp, and the brass bands immaculate. It was that moment. Arthur Corrigan had come as a solitary figure nearly overlooked, almost dismissed as irrelevant, and had left the pier as a living reminder that history walks with us in plain clothes, unannounced. For Arthur, the spectacle washed over him like rain over stone. He had endured standing ovations before, not for himself, but for the men who never came home. He took the Navy's apology with quiet grace, remained only long enough to shake the Admiral's hand once more, and then retreated into his small, ordinary life. It was how he preferred it. He had lived most of his years with anonymity as armor. The admiration was moving but unnecessary. The recognition was gratifying but hollow, if it could never be shared with those who hadn't survived Sea Serpent. He walked back into quietude as easily as he once walked into storms, carrying only one truth, that time had finally given his fallen brothers the respect they had been denied. Lieutenant Rostova, however, carried the day with a very different heaviness. She had been cut open under the sharp weight of Thompson's words, and though she wore no visible scar, she felt branded with her failure. Yet the Navy did not discharge her, did not strip her of rank. Instead, the Admiral handed her something heavier than either punishment or forgiveness: responsibility. By his order, she was reassigned to design and lead a new training initiative, one aimed at ensuring sailors would never forget the men and women who had built the institution they served. It would blend heritage, respect, and human judgment into lessons cadets and officers alike could not ignore. It was dubbed the Rostova Mandate. To some it was a punishment, a scarlet mark on her record. But to those who looked closer, it was something else, a lifeline, a test. Could she take the wound of her arrogance and reshape herself into an officer worthy of her uniform? Rostova threw herself into the task with something just short of desperation. She devoured histories she had once dismissed as irrelevant, pored over the records of forgotten sailors, and spoke with veterans who wandered bases and veterans' halls. And in that work, humility sparked where pride had stood. Slowly, painfully, she began to look beyond rules on paper and see the flesh and blood souls who lived and died beneath the breakwater of discipline. Weeks turned into months, and then came one gray, rainy Tuesday. Inside a VFW hall worn with decades of scuffed boots and laughter dulled by time, Arthur Corrigan sat alone at his usual table with a chipped mug of black coffee curling steam toward the ceiling. The place smelled of wood, beer, and faint cigarette ghosts, that odd mix of camaraderie and quiet loneliness familiar to every veteran's haunt. The door creaked open under the weight of the storm outside, and in walked Rostova. Out of uniform, stripped of her confident bulk and the shield of authority, she appeared younger, smaller, almost fragile. Civilian clothes clung to her shoulders awkwardly, as though she were still learning to inhabit a world without her rigid rank. She saw him almost immediately, sitting like a lighthouse in the dim interior. Her steps hesitated as uncertainty clawed at her, but she pressed forward, clutching something to her chest. When she stopped before him, her voice wavered. "Mr. Corrigan," she whispered, though the hall was too empty to need such softness. Arthur looked up, his expression tired but warm, his eyes carrying neither reproach nor triumph, simply a quiet welcome. "Lieutenant," he answered gently. "Please, call me Art." The words disarmed her more than any scolding had. In her hands she held a weighty book, The Complete History of Naval Special Warfare. She clutched it as though it might shield her from embarrassment. I was wondering if you would sign this." The hesitance in her words was stark, clashing with the sharpness of the officer who once barked orders at him. She looked not like authority, but like a student. Arthur's smile deepened, a small curve that reached his tired eyes. "I'd be honored," he said, and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "But only if you'll sit and share a cup of coffee." She sat awkwardly, shoulders tense, laying the book on the table. He opened it not to the title page but to the chapter on Korea, where the underwater demolition teams earned their first trial by fire. Pulling a pen from the tabletop holder, his writing hand wobbled, but the inscription was sure. "For Eva, never forget the sailors, not just the ships." "Art Corrigan." He slid the book back across the wood, and she read the words aloud with her eyes, tears stirring and spilling against all her discipline. I need to say I'm sorry," she stammered. Arthur shook his head softly, waving the apology aside as though it were only smoke. "You already have," he said. "The best apology is learning. And you're learning. That's worth more than words. His tone was gentle, but his eyes carried the firmness of someone who had once held men steady in freezing seas with only belief to cling to. As the rain pattered on the hall's windows, the old hero and the chastened young officer sat together, not as adversaries, not as officer and civilian, but as two souls bound to the same river of history. He began to tell her about Danny, the radio man who hated the dark but went anyway. And as he spoke, Rostova listened, really listened, her heart cracking open to the recognition she had once denied, that behind every patch, behind every rule book, behind every ship, there were people. And only by remembering them could one understand what it truly meant to serve. And so in that dim, rain-wrapped hall, Arthur's last great mission was not one of sabotage or survival, but one of legacy. He passed it not with medals or parades, but with a story carried across a table, from weathered hands to fresh ones. In teaching, he ensured memory would live on, not only in sealed files or admiral's words, but in the living heart of a future officer finally ready to see.